Well, Ken Stanton, as we know it today, is a music company, and at one time had a number of stores. I don't even know how many, but it would have been 10 to 15 stores all across North Georgia. And when Mr. Stanton was a young boy, he decided he wanted to play trumpet. And he had gone to the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, associated with the University of Rochester, and is considered one of the top music schools in the United States. If you had an all-star, the equivalent of an all-star football team, Eastman University would be the place to find all of these folks. Mm-hmm. Many principal players in symphony orchestras all across the United States start there. Well, he had gone there. He had been in the war and had played his trumpet in the war. And he married a young Southern girl from Metter, Georgia, Jane Trapnell, and moved to this area. Well, he eventually wanted to start this business, but he was a little disappointed to find that there were no music programs in the schools. So he went to Mr. W.P. Sprayberry, who was the superintendent of Cobb County Schools at the time, and had also been the principal at Ackworth High School, because Mr. Sprayberry lived right down the road here, right near the lake. Well, I probably wasn't a lake back then, but he lived right down the road, and convinced him that if he would allow Mr. Stanton to charge $1 per student, and I can't remember if it was per month or per year, but $1 per student, that he would start band programs in 5 different schools, 5 different high schools in Cobb, and that would
about all we had at that time.
It was that there was Ackworth, there was Osborne, there was Fitzhugh Lee, there was Smyrna, and McEachern. Those were the 5 schools, and he began those band programs there with the promise that after he got these going, that Mr. Sprayberry would start hiring music teachers for these schools. And so he did. He began that process, and sometime in the mid-50s, he let go of the Ackworth High School band and hired a fellow named Wes Baxter. And Wes was also from the north, but he was a saxophone player, and his passion was jazz. Let me back up. I believe in 1951 or 52, they decided that they needed a new high school up in the northern part of the county. So they started talking about building North Cobb High School and not closing Ackworth, but making it a elementary school. And apparently was controversial at the time because the folks in Ackworth loved their school. Mm-hmm. Well, a little interesting side note is after they opened North Cobb in 1958, it physically sits in the postal zone for Kennesaw, Georgia. But the compromise to the Ackworth folks is it would keep its Ackworth address by having a post office box in Ackworth. So an assistant principal, and when I was in school at North Cobb, it was Emory Sewell, who the stadium is named after. Mm-hmm. And Emory would get in his car and drive up to the post office here in Ackworth, get all the mail for North Cobb, and take it back. So it still had that Ackworth postal address. Now, I think after they built Kennesaw Mountain and they built Allatoona, which actually does have an Ackworth postal address, North Cobb is now considered in Kennesaw, and they don't make that trip anymore. But so they were talking about building North Cobb High School, and I think that opened in 1958. Well, when the school opened, Wes Baxter moved from Ackworth to North Cobb, and decided that this music thing was nice, but he wanted to do something else. So he went to law school at night. And he got his law degree in 1962 from the Atlanta Law School, and he became a lawyer. But he had for years and years and years a big band that he played, that he directed and played in, really almost up until the time he passed away, I believe, in the early teens. So 2011, 2012, sometime in there, he passed away. And his law office was in Smyrna, not too far from where I began my career at Wills High School as the band director there. And so he was the band director for some 8 or so years, combined from Ackworth to North Cobb. And when I was in high school, we had this big bass drum head, and it had a warrior on it, and it said North Cobb Band, Ackworth, Georgia, but you could see where Ackworth Band had been scratched out and North Cobb Band over that. And I brought some pictures of the Ackworth Band, I think with Mr. Stanton as the director, and you can see that drum in the photograph. So I don't know what happened to it. I asked the recently retired director not long ago, and he said he never remembered seeing that. But so after North Cobb was built and Mr. Baxter went on to his legal career, they hired a fellow named James Poulos, James G. Poulos. He only stayed here a couple of years because he got a position. I think he was from North Carolina. He got a position at Catawba College in North Carolina and retired from there. As I said, Mr. Redwine was the band director when I was here, and then he was not a fan of marching band. He really liked the concert band. So they hired a fellow named Scott Ragsdale to teach the marching band. And when Jack Redwine left in '78, Scott took over the program. I was at Wills High School teaching as a young, brand new teacher, and Jack Redwine actually came to Nash Middle School, which fed my program, and he and I got to work together as colleagues for 2 years.
How was that?
That it was great because he knew me. I knew him. Our philosophies were the same because he had been my mentor and my inspiration. So it was a great relationship working together, and we had a lot of fun. It was a different perspective than teacher-student, although I still called him Mr. Redwine. I never could refer to him as Jack to his face, but a good man. And Scott decided that he had a psychology degree, and he decided he wanted to practice in that profession, so he got his master's degree and went on to have a counseling practice for a long number of years. And so I followed him in 1980.
So you went from Wills to
North Cobb.
North Cobb.
I
Okay.
did, and I stayed there for 5 years. I decided that I wanted to be a lawyer as well.
Were you influenced by Wes Baxter in that decision?
I didn't know that story at that time,
Okay.
but it is interesting to see that a couple of us went that route. There had been a band director that was one of my contemporaries up in the Rome, Georgia area, who had gone that route and gone to law school. I had cousins who were lawyers, and at our family reunions we'd talk about what they did, and I just thought it was interesting. So I took the plunge. I went to John Marshall Law School in Atlanta at night while I taught during the day. Probably never worked harder in my life. And in my first year of law school was 1984-85, and that was my last year at North Cobb because I felt like I wasn't doing myself nor the students any good because I wasn't giving everything
Much time.
to either that those kids deserved. So the school district created their first assistant band director positions, and I took one of those at Sprayberry High School and its feeder program, so that would be McCleskey and J.J. Daniel, and worked for that until I finished my law degree. And during one of the summers, I was did an internship with our district attorney's office and just fell in love with that work. And so I got a job with them after I passed the bar and went with them.
I guess that's Tom Sharon at that time?
Yes, and he
District attorney?
It is interesting with that Tom was our longest-serving prosecutor in Cobb County. The Cobb County Judicial Circuit was formed in the 1953 or 1954, I believe. It was carved out of the circuit in the northern part of the state.
Still the Blue Ridge Circuit?
The Blue Ridge Circuit. And so Tom was our longest-serving DA and prosecutor until I passed him last year. So Tom served for 22 years, and I'm currently sitting at 24 years. So.